15 years ago, an entire high school football team stepped off their bus after a championship game and vanished into thin air. 22 young athletes, their coach, and their driver, all gone without a trace on what should have been the greatest night of their lives. Picture this. It's October 22nd, 2010, in rural Ohio. The Crestwood High Hawks had just crushed their rivals 28-14 in the state championship semifinals. The fog was rolling in thick across the countryside as their yellow school bus wound its way home through the darkness. Parents waited in their driveways, porch lights on, victory celebrations planned. But those lights would burn all night long because nobody ever came home. How could 25 people disappear without leaving behind so much as a footprint? How could an entire community's future vanish in a single night? And why did it take 15 years and a desperate mother's discovery to finally uncover the truth? What she found would unravel one of the most chilling mysteries in true crime history, a truth so disturbing that it would shake this small Ohio town to its very core. Crestwood, Ohio wasn't just a town, it was a family. Population 3,200, where everybody knew everybody, where Friday night lights weren't just entertainment, but a sacred ritual that brought the entire community together. Main Street stretched for exactly 6 blocks, lined with family-owned businesses that had served generations. The smell of fresh apple cider from Morrison's orchard mixed with the autumn air, and on game nights, you could hear the crowd cheering from miles away. The Crestwood High Hawks weren't just a football team. They were hometown heroes. These boys had grown up together, played Little League together, shared dreams of college scholarships and NFL glory. Leading them was Jake Miller, the Golden Boy quarterback with a rocket arm and a smile that could light up the darkest night. College scouts from Ohio State, Michigan, and Notre Dame had been circling like vultures all season, and Jake was loving every minute of it. Behind Jake's success stood Coach Daniel Harper, a man who dedicated his life to shaping young men into champions. Harper had been coaching at Crestwood for 23 years, had seen 3 generations of players pass through his program. He was tough as nails on the field, but had a heart of gold off it. The kind of coach who'd drive across town at midnight if one of his players needed help. Among the 22 players was Ethan Carter, a 17-year-old linebacker with more heart than size. Ethan wasn't the strongest or fastest, but he played every down like his life depended on it. His mother Linda had raised him alone since his father walked out when Ethan was 8, working double shifts at the hospital to keep their small house and put food on the table. Football wasn't just Ethan's passion. It was their ticket to a better life, a college scholarship that would give him opportunities Linda never had. That night, October 22nd, everything was perfect. The Hawks had dominated in every phase of the game. Jake threw for 312 yards and 3 touchdowns. The defense, anchored by Ethan's fierce determination, held their opponents to just 6 first downs. The crowd erupted as the final seconds ticked away, parents rushing onto the field to embrace their sons, cameras flashing, victory chants echoing across the stadium. The team boarded Bus 47 at 9:15 p.m. for the hour-long ride home. The driver, Robert Klein, was relatively new. He'd started just 3 weeks earlier when their regular driver had a heart attack. But he seemed competent enough, a quiet man in his 40s who kept to himself and always showed up on time. Linda Carter stood in the parking lot, watching the taillights disappear into the fog. She'd planned a small celebration at home. Ethan's favorite chocolate chip cookies were cooling on the counter, and she'd even splurged on a bottle of sparkling cider. She drove home slowly, savoring the moment, thinking about how proud she was of her son and how bright their future looked. At 10:47 p.m., Linda's phone rang. It was Carol Miller, Jake's mother, her voice tight with worry. "Linda, is Ethan home yet? Jake still hasn't arrived, and I'm starting to get concerned." By 11:30, 6 more parents had called. By midnight, police cars were racing through the countryside with sirens wailing and flashing lights cutting through the darkness. At 1:23 a.m., they found Bus 47 sitting in the middle of a harvested cornfield, 10 miles from town. The front door was wide open, swaying gently in the night breeze. Personal belongings were scattered across the seats: backpacks, jerseys, cell phones, even a few wallets with cash still inside. But there wasn't a single person to be found. But one detail about that bus didn't add up. A detail so subtle that it would take 15 years for anyone to notice its true significance. Dawn broke gray and cold over Crestwood on October 23rd, revealing a community transformed by panic. Word spread like wildfire. At the diner, at the post office, at church, the same impossible question echoed. How do 25 people just vanish? Sheriff Tom Bradley had been lawman in Crestwood for 18 years, dealing mostly with vandalism, the occasional drunk driving arrest, and disputes between neighbors over property lines. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. Within hours, the FBI arrived from Columbus, their black SUVs looking alien against the rural landscape. Special Agent Sarah Chun took charge of the investigation, her crisp professionalism a stark contrast to the raw emotion consuming the town. The search was massive and immediate. Helicopters thundered overhead, their rotors beating like mechanical hearts as they scoured every field, every patch of woods, every abandoned building for miles around. Search and rescue teams with trained dogs arrived from 3 counties, their German shepherds leading them through thickets and creek beds. Volunteers organized by the hundreds, teachers, shop owners, farmers, anyone who could walk formed search lines that stretched across the countryside. Linda Carter was among the first volunteers, her hospital scrubs still on from her shift the night before. She hadn't slept, couldn't eat, could barely think about anything except finding Ethan. She joined search party after search party, her voice growing hoarse from calling his name across empty fields. The FBI's initial theories seemed logical, but led nowhere. Abduction? There were no ransom demands, no signs of struggle, no witnesses who'd seen anything suspicious. Mass runaway situation? Impossible. These boys were weeks away from college recruitment visits, months from graduating and achieving their dreams. Accident? The bus showed no signs of mechanical failure or collision damage. The timeline made no sense. Bus 47's GPS showed it had followed the normal route home until 9:43 p.m., when it suddenly stopped transmitting data. A grainy security camera at Murphy's gas station captured the bus passing by at 9:45 p.m., but the driver's face was obscured by the visor of his cap, and the angle made it impossible to see into the bus interior. Robert Klein, the driver, had no criminal record, no debts, no obvious motive for harming the team. He'd seemed like a quiet, reliable man. His small apartment revealed few personal belongings and no clues. Bank records showed nothing unusual. It was as if he'd vanished as completely as the team he was driving. The abandoned bus itself told a haunting story. Ethan's gym bag sat exactly where he'd left it, his championship game jersey folded neatly on top. Jake Miller's playbook lay open to the victory formation they'd run to seal their win. A half-eaten bag of Doritos suggested the boys had been relaxed, celebrating their victory during the drive home. Everything indicated a normal trip that had suddenly, inexplicably, gone wrong. Linda found herself returning to that bus every day, despite police tape and FBI agents trying to keep civilians away. She'd stand there in the cornfield, morning mist rising around her ankles, and try to imagine what had happened to her son. Sometimes she'd place her hand on the cold metal door frame and whisper Ethan's name, as if somehow he might hear her across whatever void had swallowed him. Days turned into weeks. The media attention was intense at first. CNN, Fox News, even 60 Minutes did segments on the Vanishing Hawks. But as no new evidence emerged, as every lead proved false, the cameras packed up and moved on to fresher mysteries. The FBI scaled back their operation. The volunteers went back to their daily lives. The helicopters stopped flying. But Linda Carter never stopped searching. 6 months after the disappearance, she made a discovery that would haunt her for years. While organizing a community fundraiser for the ongoing search efforts, Linda was going through boxes of the team's belongings that parents had donated, old photos, newspaper clippings, anything that might provide a clue. At the bottom of one box, she found Ethan's jersey from the previous season, and wrapped inside, it was his practice journal. Linda had never seen the journal before. Ethan had never mentioned keeping one. As she flipped through pages of play diagrams and training notes, her heart nearly stopped. On the final page, barely visible in pencil, someone had scratched a symbol, a crescent moon with a star inside. But just when the case seemed to be growing cold, a chilling rumor began to spread through Crestwood, whispered in grocery store aisles and church parking lots. A rumor that would change everything. The rumor started small, the way dangerous secrets always do in small towns. Martha Henley, who lived on Elm Street, mentioned to her bridge club that she'd seen strange lights in the woods behind her house the night the team vanished. Not flashlights or car headlights, but something else, something that pulsed and moved in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. Sarah O'Connell, who worked the late shift at the truck stop, claimed she'd seen a convoy of black vehicles heading toward the old mining road around the same time the bus disappeared. When pressed for details, she became vague, nervous, as if speaking about it might bring trouble to her doorstep. Old Henry Walsh, the town drunk whose stories nobody usually believed, insisted he'd seen robed figures in the woods behind the football field months before the disappearance. They was watching the boys practice. He'd slur to anyone who'd listen. Standing there in them trees, just watching. Linda Carter, desperate for any lead, began following up on these whispers. She drove out to Martha Henley's house and stood in the woman's backyard, staring into the dense woods where Ethan used to hunt rabbits as a boy. Martha pointed to a clearing about half a mile in, where the trees formed a natural circle. "That's where I saw the lights," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Pulsing like a heartbeat, red and gold and purple. Lasted about 2 hours, then just stopped. The more Linda investigated, the more she realized that Crestwood had secrets buried deeper than anyone imagined. Longtime residents would grow uncomfortable when she asked about local history, changing the subject, or finding excuses to end conversations. The town library had entire sections of local records that were mysteriously being reorganized and unavailable for research. Linda began driving through Crestwood at night, learning the rhythm of her town's secret life. She noticed that certain houses went dark earlier than others, that some residents seemed to follow patterns she'd never observed before. She started keeping a notebook, tracking movements, conversations, anything that might reveal what was really happening in her hometown. Her breakthrough came through Ethan's closest friend on the team, Marcus Webb, who'd been benched with a sprained ankle and hadn't made the championship trip. Marcus had always been shy around adults, but Linda's gentle persistence finally got him talking. What he revealed made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Carter," Marcus said, his voice shaking, "there was stuff happening with the team that nobody knew about. Meetings after practice, secret meetings that Coach Harper said we couldn't tell anyone about, not even our parents." According to Marcus, these meetings had started 3 months before the championship game. A man who called himself the guide would appear after regular practice ended, speaking to small groups of players about leadership, about the ancient traditions of warriors, about the special destiny that awaited young men who were strong enough to embrace their true calling. "He knew things about us," Marcus continued, tears forming in his eyes. "Private things, family stuff, our dreams about college and football careers. He'd tell us we were chosen, that we had potential most people would never understand." Jake and some of the older guys, they really started buying into it. The guide wasn't from Crestwood. Marcus was sure of that. He spoke with an accent that might have been Southern, wore expensive clothes, and drove different vehicles each time he appeared. He never gave his real name, and he insisted that what was discussed in these meetings was sacred secret. Ethan was getting really into it toward the end, Marcus admitted. He started carrying that little notebook everywhere, drawing symbols and writing down things the guide taught them. He said it was going to change everything for him, that he was going to be part of something bigger than football, bigger than college. Linda felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She realized she'd been searching for her son in all the wrong places. Ethan hadn't been taken against his will. He'd been recruited, groomed, convinced to participate in something that his young mind couldn't fully understand. That night, Linda sat at her kitchen table with Ethan's practice journal open before her, staring at that strange symbol he'd drawn, the crescent moon with the star inside. She traced it with her finger, wondering what it meant, what organization or belief system it represented. Using her computer, she began researching occult symbols, religious iconography, anything that might match what Ethan had drawn. Page after page of search results yielded nothing until, at 3:47 a.m., she found what she was looking for. The symbol matched exactly with historical records of a group called the Order of the Crescent, a secretive organization that had operated in rural Ohio since the 1920s. According to fragmented accounts, the order recruited young people for initiation rituals that took place in remote locations. Most disturbing of all, there were multiple historical reports of entire groups of initiates disappearing without explanation. Linda's hands trembled as she read testimonies from former members who'd escaped the order decades earlier. They described a cult-like organization that preyed on vulnerable young people, promising them power, purpose, and belonging in exchange for absolute loyalty. The initiation process involved isolation from family and friends, psychological conditioning, and ultimately, complete submission to the order's leadership. One account particularly chilled her. A man named David Brennan had written to authorities in 1987, claiming that his younger brother had been recruited by the order in 1973 and had vanished during an initiation ceremony. They take the young ones deep into the woods, Brennan had written. They make them believe they're part of something ancient and sacred, and then they make them choose between their old life and their new one. Most choose the new life, because by then they've been convinced their families never loved them anyway. Linda realized she was no longer dealing with a simple kidnapping or accident. She was facing an organization that had perfected the art of stealing children's minds before stealing their bodies. And somewhere out there, her son might still be alive, might still be hoping that someone would find him and bring him home. Armed with this terrible knowledge, Linda made a decision that would change the course of the investigation forever. She was going to confront the one person who might know the truth about what had really happened to the Crestwood Hawks. Linda Carter's hands shook as she held Ethan's journal under the harsh fluorescent light of her kitchen. There was again that symbol drawn over and over in the margins of different pages, sometimes small and hidden between lines of text, other times large and bold across entire pages. The crescent moon with the star inside wasn't just a doodle. It was an obsession. She counted 17 different instances of the symbol throughout the journal. But more disturbing were the words scattered around it. Chosen, awakening, true brotherhood, the calling. In Ethan's careful handwriting, she found phrases that didn't sound like her son at all. The old ways are dying, but we are the ones who will bring them back. Blood calls to blood, and we answer. Linda had always prided herself on knowing her son completely. She'd been there for every scraped knee, every failed test, every triumph on the football field. But these pages revealed a Ethan she'd never met, a young man drawn to something dark and secret, something that promised him an identity beyond what his small-town life could offer. The next morning, Linda drove to the Columbus Public Library, 3 hours away, where she could research without the prying eyes of Crestwood neighbors. What she discovered in old newspaper archives and historical records made her stomach turn. The Order of the Crescent had a history in Ohio stretching back nearly a century. Founded by a charismatic drifter named Cornelius Blackwood in 1923, the order claimed to preserve ancient wisdom and prepare chosen individuals for a coming transformation of society. Blackwood had established compounds in remote areas throughout southeastern Ohio, attracting followers who believed they were part of a sacred mission. But the order's true nature was far more sinister. Police records from the 1940s through 1980s documented multiple investigations into missing persons cases linked to the organization. Young people would disappear after attending order gatherings, leaving behind families who never heard from them again. Survivors who eventually escaped described brainwashing techniques, forced isolation, and rituals designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it according to the order's twisted philosophy. Most chilling of all, Linda found a police report from 1983 detailing the discovery of an abandoned order compound near Marietta, Ohio. Investigators had found evidence that dozens of young people had lived there over the years, but when authorities raided the site, it was completely empty. Personal belongings, including high school yearbooks and family photos, were left behind as if the occupants had simply vanished into thin air. Linda printed every document she could find and drove home through the darkness, her mind racing. The order had been operating in Ohio for decades, targeting young people, making them disappear. And somehow, they'd gotten to the Crestwood Hawks. Back home, she spread the documents across her kitchen table and began making connections. The dates were crucial. Order activity seemed to spike every 15 to 20 years, always in rural communities, always targeting groups rather than individuals. Crestwood fit the pattern perfectly, isolated, trusting, with a tight-knit population that would be slow to suspect outsiders. But Linda needed more than historical patterns. She needed to find someone who could tell her how the order operated in the modern era, someone who might know where they'd taken Ethan and his teammates. Her search led her to Thomas Morrison, a man now living in Arizona who'd grown up in Crestwood in the 1970s. Morrison had left town suddenly in 1979, and Linda had always wondered why. She found his phone number through online directories and called him, her heart hammering as the phone rang. "Mr. Morrison, this is Linda Carter from Crestwood. I need to ask you about something that happened a long time ago." The silence on the other end lasted so long that Linda thought the connection had been dropped. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I wondered when someone would finally call. I've been waiting 35 years for someone to ask the right questions. Morrison agreed to meet her, but not in Ohio. "They have eyes and ears everywhere," he warned. "If you want the truth, you'll have to come to me." 3 days later, Linda sat across from Thomas Morrison in a coffee shop in Phoenix, Arizona. He was 58 years old, his hair prematurely gray, his eyes holding the haunted look of someone who'd seen things he could never forget. "The order took my younger brother Danny in 1979, Morrison began. He was 17, captain of the wrestling team, honor student. They got to him through a recruiter who posed as a college scout. By the time I realized what was happening, Danny was already too far gone." Morrison described how the order's recruitment worked. They identified young people with leadership potential, athletes, student council members, kids who were admired by their peers. The initial contact was always innocent, a talent scout, a youth counselor, someone offering opportunities that seemed too good to pass up. "They're patient," Morrison continued. "They spend months building trust, learning about their target's dreams and vulnerabilities. They make these kids feel special, chosen, like they're destined for greatness. And by the time the truth comes out, the kids don't want to leave. They believe they've found their true family." Morrison had tried to rescue his brother, tracking the order to a compound in the hills outside Crestwood. What he'd found there still gave him nightmares. There were maybe 40 kids living there, ranging from teenagers to young adults in their 20s. They all had this blank look in their eyes, like they were sleepwalking. They'd been so thoroughly brainwashed that they didn't even recognize their own family members. Danny looked right through me like I was a stranger. When Morrison tried to talk to his brother, order members surrounded them, politely but firmly escorting him off the property. That night, the entire compound disappeared. Buildings abandoned, vehicles gone, not a trace of the 40 young people who'd been living there just hours earlier. That's what they do, Morrison explained. When they feel threatened, when outside attention gets too intense, they move the whole operation. They have multiple compounds, safe houses, ways of transporting large groups without detection. And the kids go willingly because by then, they believe their old lives were meaningless. Linda felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the full horror of the situation became clear. Ethan wasn't being held against his will. He'd been conditioned to want to stay away. Somewhere out there, her son was alive but lost, believing that his mother and everything he'd once loved were obstacles to his true destiny. But Morrison had one more piece of information that changed everything. There's someone still in Crestwood who knows the truth, he said quietly. Someone who was part of the order but tried to get out. They might still be there, might still have connections. If you can find them, if you can get them to talk, they might be able to tell you where the order took your son. Morrison pulled out a faded photograph showing a group of young people standing in front of a wooden building. In the background, barely visible, was a man in his 30s wearing a Crestwood High Letterman jacket. Daniel Harper, Morrison said. Your son's football coach. He was there when they took my brother. Linda Carter's world tilted on its axis as she stared at the faded photograph. Coach Harper, the man she'd trusted with her son's future, the man who'd shaped Ethan's character and dreams. He'd been connected to the order all along. The drive back to Ohio felt endless. Linda's mind raced through memories, looking for signs she'd missed. Coach Harper's mysterious past, the way he'd moved to Crestwood in 1995 with no family, no connections, just impeccable coaching credentials. His intense interest in his players' personal lives, the way he'd earned their complete trust and devotion. The after-practice meetings that parents were never invited to attend. It had taken her 15 years to see the pattern, but now it was impossible to ignore. Linda found Coach Harper living in a small trailer on the outskirts of town, far from the comfortable suburban home where he'd lived during his coaching years. The man who answered her knock bore little resemblance to the confident leader who'd once commanded the respect of players and parents alike. His hair was unkempt, his clothes disheveled, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone carrying unbearable guilt. Mrs. Carter, he said quietly, not seeming surprised to see her. I've been wondering when you'd come. She followed him into the cramped trailer, noting the newspaper clippings about the missing team taped to every wall. Photos of the Hawks covered every surface. Not celebration shots from games, but candid pictures from practices, team dinners, moments when the boys were relaxed and unguarded. You've been living with this for 15 years, Linda said. Not a question, but a statement. Harper sat heavily in a worn armchair and buried his face in his hands. When he looked up, tears were streaming down his cheeks. I never meant for it to happen, he whispered. You have to believe me. I joined the order when I was young and stupid, back in the 70s. They promised me things, purpose, belonging, the chance to be part of something greater than myself. By the time I realized what they really were, I was in too deep to get out easily. Harper's story unfolded slowly, painfully. He'd been recruited during his senior year of high school in 1977, drawn in by promises of brotherhood and ancient wisdom. Like the others, he'd been gradually isolated from his family and friends, his reality reshaped by the order's teachings. For 3 years, he'd lived in their compounds, believing he was part of sacred mission. But I started seeing things, Harper continued. Kids who asked too many questions would disappear. Families who came looking for their children would be threatened or worse. I realized I wasn't part of something holy, I was part of something evil. Harper had escaped in 1980, but the order didn't let members go easily. They'd held his younger sister as leverage, threatening her life if he ever spoke about what he'd seen. So he'd made a deal. He'd move to a new town, establish himself in a position where he could identify potential recruits, and in exchange, his sister would be released and left alone. They chose Crestwood because it was isolated, trusting, the perfect hunting ground, Harper said, his voice breaking. I was supposed to identify the strongest leaders, the kids with the most potential. But I thought I could protect them. I thought if I was careful, if I only gave them names of players who were already planning to leave town for college anyway, maybe no harm would come. For 20 years, Harper had walked a tightrope. He'd provided the order with information about promising students, but he'd also worked to strengthen his players' ties to their families and community, hoping to make them less vulnerable to recruitment. It was a delicate balance that had seemed to work until 2010. Something changed that year, Harper explained. The order was under pressure from law enforcement in other states. They needed a big recruitment class, a whole group at once rather than individuals over time. And they wanted the best, not just good athletes, but natural leaders who could help them rebuild their organization. The championship team had been perfect. 22 young men at the peak of their physical and emotional development, bonded together by shared victories, trusting their coach completely. The order had been planning their recruitment for months, sending the guide to soften them up with promises of elite training and special opportunities. I tried to stop it, Harper said, desperation creeping into his voice. I went to the FBI, tried to warn them about what was coming. But the order found out about my betrayal. They moved faster than I expected. The night of the championship game, Harper had received a call telling him that if he wanted to live, he would stay away from the victory celebration and keep his mouth shut. By the time he'd worked up the courage to defy them, the team was already gone. Robert Klein wasn't just a bus driver, Harper revealed. He was one of their recruiters, probably a former member they'd sent to establish a cover identity. The boys trusted him because I'd approved his hiring. They had no idea they were being led into a trap. Linda felt rage building in her chest. Where did they take them? Harper shook his head miserably. The order has dozens of compounds scattered across the country. They move people constantly to avoid detection. By now, after 15 years, he couldn't finish the sentence. Are they alive? Linda demanded. Probably. The order doesn't kill people. That draws too much attention. They remake them. By now, your son and his teammates have been so thoroughly conditioned that they believe their old lives were meaningless. They think they're part of something sacred, something worth any sacrifice. Harper's phone rang, startling them both. He looked at the caller ID and went pale. It's them, he whispered. They know you're here. But Harper surprised Linda by answering the call, putting it on speaker. Daniel, a smooth voice said, I believe you have a visitor we need to discuss. She deserves to know the truth, Harper replied, his voice stronger than it had been all evening. The truth, Daniel, is that some children outgrow their need for their parents. Miss Carter's son made his choice long ago. Perhaps it's time she made hers. Accept his decision and move on, or risk learning just how far our reach extends. The line went dead, leaving Linda and Harper staring at each other in terrified silence. Then Harper stood up and walked to a closet in the back of the trailer. He returned carrying a small wooden box. There's something else you need to see, he said quietly. Something that might help you find them. Inside the box were dozens of photographs, recent ones. The images showed young people in their 20s and 30s, working in gardens, participating in what looked like educational seminars, living in a community that appeared peaceful and prosperous. But Linda's breath caught in her throat when she recognized one of the faces. It was Ethan, but not the 17-year-old boy she remembered. This was a grown man of 32, his face calm and serene, his eyes holding a strange kind of peace. He was standing next to a woman about his age, both of them smiling at the camera. "This photo was taken 6 months ago," Harper said softly. "They send them to me sometimes, to show me that the people I help them find are happy, fulfilled. They want me to believe I did the right thing." Linda's hands trembled as she studied her son's face. He looked content, even joyful. But there was something missing in his expression, some spark of individuality that had been quietly extinguished. "Where is this?" she whispered. Harper pointed to a postmark on the envelope containing the photos. "Montana. Remote area. Off the grid. If you're really determined to find him, that's where you'd start looking." "But Mrs. Carter," Harper added, his voice filled with warning, "you need to understand something. The man in that photograph isn't the son you remember. 15 years of conditioning, 15 years of being told that his old life was a lie and his new life is sacred. He won't want to come home. He might not even remember who you are." Linda studied the photograph again, memorizing every detail of her son's face. He was alive. After 15 years of not knowing, of hoping and fearing and searching, she finally had proof that Ethan was alive. But one photo would change everything she thought she knew about her son's disappearance, and about whether he truly wanted to be found. Linda Carter held her breath as Coach Harper reached into the wooden box and pulled out one more photograph, this one newer than the rest. His hand shook as he handed it to her. "This came 2 weeks ago," he whispered. The photograph showed a group of people standing in front of a rustic wooden building surrounded by mountains. In the center of the group was Ethan, now clearly a man in his 30s, but something was different about this image. His expression wasn't the serene, calm Linda had seen in the previous photo. His eyes held a spark she recognized, the same fierce determination that had driven him on the football field all those years ago. But it was the handwritten note on the back of the photograph that made Linda's heart race. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means Coach Harper finally told you the truth. I'm sorry it took so long. We need to talk. There's so much you don't understand. E." The message was in Ethan's handwriting, unmistakably his. Linda had seen that same careful script on homework assignments, thank you notes, and the birthday cards he'd made for her throughout his childhood. "He remembers," Linda breathed. "He remembers me." Harper nodded grimly. "That's what worries them. The order's conditioning usually lasts forever, but occasionally someone breaks through it. When that happens, they become a threat to everything the order has built." Linda studied the photograph more carefully. Now she could see subtle signs she'd missed at first glance. While most of the people in the group appeared relaxed and content, a few showed signs of tension. Their smiles seemed forced. Their postures suggested wariness rather than peace. And in the background, barely visible, were 2 men in dark clothing who clearly weren't part of the community. They looked more like guards. "He's in danger, isn't he?" Linda asked. "Anyone who starts remembering their old life becomes a liability," Harper confirmed. "The order has ways of dealing with that. Sometimes they increase the conditioning, use drugs or psychological techniques to suppress the memories. Sometimes they relocate the person to a more isolated compound. And sometimes—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Linda made a decision that had been building for 15 years. She was going to find her son, no matter what it took, no matter how dangerous it became. But she wouldn't go alone. The next morning, Linda walked into the FBI field office in Columbus, carrying copies of every document she'd collected, every photograph Coach Harper had shown her, and every piece of evidence she'd gathered about the Order of the Crescent. Special Agent Sarah Chun, now 15 years older but still sharp and determined, listened to Linda's story with growing amazement. "We never stopped investigating the Hawks case," Chun admitted. "It's been one of our most frustrating cold cases. But we never had enough evidence to pursue the cult angle seriously." Within 48 hours, Chun had assembled a task force combining FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and local law enforcement from 3 states. The photographs Harper had provided gave them their first real lead in over a decade. Satellite imagery analysis helped them identify the mountain compound where Ethan and potentially other members of the original team were being held. But as they planned their operation, Linda received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was older, weathered, but unmistakably familiar. It was the voice that had once cheered her on at high school basketball games, the voice that had sung lullabies when she was sick, the voice she thought she'd never hear again. "Mom!" Linda's legs gave out, and she collapsed into a chair. "Ethan?" "Oh my God, Ethan, is that really you?" "It's me, Mom. I'm okay, but we don't have much time. They're planning to move us again, and this time it's going to be somewhere I can't contact you from. I need you to listen carefully." Through tears, Linda listened as her son, her grown son, explained what had really happened 15 years ago. The team hadn't been kidnapped in any traditional sense. They'd been gradually recruited over months, convinced that they were special, chosen for something greater than their small-town lives could offer. By the time they boarded that bus, most of them genuinely wanted to disappear. "I believe it all, Mom," Ethan said, his voice thick with regret. "The guide made us feel like we were warriors, like we had a sacred destiny. When they told us we had to choose between our old lives and our new purpose, it didn't even feel like a choice. I thought I was becoming something better. But the reality of life with the Order had been far from the paradise they'd been promised. Years of isolation, psychological manipulation, and gradual erasure of individual identity had followed. Most of the original Hawks were still completely under the Order's influence, but a few, including Jake Miller and 2 others, had begun to question their situation. "We've been planning this for months," Ethan explained. "We can't just walk away. They have too much control, too many ways to track us. But if the FBI raids the compound while we're causing a distraction from the inside, some of us might make it out." "Ethan, no," Linda pleaded. "It's too dangerous. Just wait. Let the authorities handle this." "Mom, you don't understand. Tomorrow they're splitting us up and sending us to different compounds across the country. This is our only chance. And Mom, there are others here, not just from our team. Kids who've been taken over the years, some of them for decades. If we don't act now, they'll never get free." The line crackled with static, and Linda could hear shouting in the background. "I have to go," Ethan said urgently. "Mom, I need you to know. Every day for 15 years, I've thought about you. Even when they convinced me that my old life was meaningless, part of me never forgot how much you loved me. That's what finally broke through their programming. That's what saved me." The connection went dead, leaving Linda staring at the phone in her hands. Within hours, Special Agent Shun had moved up the timeline for their operation. The raid would happen at dawn, coordinated with Ethan and his allies' internal disruption. Linda begged to be included, but Shun refused. It was too dangerous, and Linda's emotional connection to the situation could compromise the operation. So Linda did what she'd been doing for 15 years. She waited. The call came at 7:23 a.m. Agent Chin's voice was tight with controlled excitement. "We got them, Linda. We got most of them. The raid had been a success, but not without casualties." The Order's leadership had anticipated the possibility of law enforcement intervention and had prepared accordingly. When FBI agents surrounded the compound, armed Order members had engaged in a firefight that lasted nearly an hour. In the chaos, many of the younger Order members, including several of the original Crestwood Hawks, had escaped into the surrounding mountains. Others had been captured, but refused to cooperate, claiming they were being persecuted for their religious beliefs. The compound itself had been partially destroyed by fires set during the conflict. 6 months later, Linda Carter sat across from her son in a small cafe in Columbus, Ohio. Ethan looked different than he had in the photographs. Thinner, more cautious, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, as if he expected danger to appear at any moment. The federal deprogramming specialists had done their best, but 15 years of psychological conditioning had left scars that might never fully heal. "I remember everything now," Ethan said quietly, stirring his coffee without drinking it. The good and the bad. Sometimes I wish I could forget again. Of the original 22 Hawks who had vanished that October night in 2010, 12 had been found and freed during the raid and subsequent investigations. 3 had died over the years. Natural causes, the order claimed, though federal investigators suspected otherwise. The remaining 7, including former quarterback Jake Miller, were still missing, presumably at other order compounds that had yet to be discovered. Coach Harper had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation with federal investigators. His information had led to the discovery of 4 additional order compounds across the country, resulting in the rescue of over 60 people who had been missing for periods ranging from 6 months to 30 years. Robert Klein, the bus driver who had delivered the Hawks to their fate, had died in 2018. His personal effects, recovered from a storage unit in Nevada, included detailed records of order operations dating back to the 1980s. These documents had proven invaluable in understanding the scope of the organization and identifying other victims. The Order of the Crescent itself had been effectively dismantled, its leadership either dead or in federal prison. But Linda knew that didn't mean the story was over. Cults and predatory organizations had a way of reconstituting themselves under new names, with new leaders, always ready to exploit the vulnerable and the searching. "Do you regret it?" Linda asked her son. "Leaving with them, I mean." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, watching traffic pass by the cafe window. "I regret the pain I caused you. I regret the years we lost. But Mom, I was 17 years old, and someone convinced me I could be part of something important, something that mattered. How was I supposed to know they were lying?" Linda reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were calloused from years of manual labor at the compound, marked by small scars that told stories she might never hear. "You couldn't have known," she said firmly. "You were a child who trusted the wrong adults. That's not your fault." They talked about practical things. Ethan's housing situation, his job prospects, his plans for continuing the education that had been interrupted 15 years ago. The federal government provided support for order survivors, but rebuilding a life from nothing was a daunting prospect for anyone, let alone someone whose formative years had been stolen. "There's something else," Ethan said as they prepared to leave. "The FBI wants me to speak at schools, help educate kids about recruitment tactics used by groups like the Order. Would you come with me? I don't think I can do it alone." Linda's answer came without hesitation. "Of course. We'll do it together." As they walked to the parking garage, Linda reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 15 years of searching, of refusing to give up hope, of following every lead, no matter how slim. The crucial detail that had broken the case wide open, that symbol in Ethan's journal, had been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for a mother's love to notice what everyone else had missed. The story of the Vanishing Hawks had become national news, featured in documentaries and true crime podcasts, studied by law enforcement agencies as an example of how predatory groups operate. But for Linda, it would always be something much simpler and more personal. The story of never giving up on someone you love, even when the whole world tells you it's hopeless. "Mom," Ethan said as they reached her car. "Yes. Thank you for never stopping. Thank you for finding me when I couldn't find myself." Linda pulled her son into a hug, feeling the solid reality of him, breathing in the scent that was still familiar after all these years. They had a long road ahead of them, months or maybe years of rebuilding their relationship, of helping Ethan heal from trauma that most people couldn't imagine. But they would walk that road together. And somewhere out there, Jake Miller and 6 other young men were still waiting to be found, still hoping that someone cared enough to keep looking. Linda had made a promise to their families, and she intended to keep it. The search would continue, because sometimes the most important detail is the one that refuses to stay hidden, the one that waits patiently for the right person to notice it, to understand its significance, and to follow it all the way home. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the young people in your own community who might be vulnerable to predatory groups, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell us, what would you do if someone you love vanished without a trace? How far would you go to bring them home? Subscribe for more true crime stories that matter, stories that remind us why we must never stop fighting for the missing, the lost, and the forgotten. Because sometimes, one person's refusal to give up can change everything. Thank you for listening, and remember, love is the most powerful force in the world, strong enough to reach across any distance, survive any separation, and bring even the lost souls home.